Well, I mean, I think maybe the best thing to do is to situate this book initially. I mean, this book was written basically in 1979 and 1980. And at that time, what I was trying to do is I was trying to inject a notion of critical theory into education that had been relatively absent. And it was very difficult because the Frankfurt School didn't really talk much about education, to say the least. There was some references, but overall, that really wasn't being done. And there were a whole range of topics that I wanted to address that I felt in some way were relevant, but had fallen short of a more comprehensive and complicated understanding of education. And as the book title suggests, Theory and Resistance, two things were going on in my mind at the time. Whether or not they were valid is another question. But at one level, I wanted to inject a notion of theory into educational discourses in which theory wasn't where you began with the problem, it was a resource. So I wasn't concerned about saying here's theory and then there's education, here's what it should do. I was more concerned about saying, look, given the current state of education in the United States and in many other places, how do we use theory to understand this and what value does it have? And how do we make it recognizable in ways that it becomes a resource without losing its ability to be rigorous? That was the first issue. Secondly, I wanted to draw upon a tradition that was emerging at that time in the UK and in the United States called the sociology of education. And they were trying very hard to really understand what the notion of resistance was about. Because there was an alarming sense after 1977, and particularly with the work of Bourdieu and people like Gintis, Bowles, and Gintis. They had written a book called Capitalism in American Society, something along those lines. And the book really sort of took up on a theme that I wanted to contest. There was the assumption that schools were simply prisons, right? I mean, that's all they were, you know. And in that analysis, there was almost no sense of resistance. But even worse, there was a sense that domination was simply, that power was simply about domination. And there was no way to talk about power in a way that was more fruitful, more energizing, and opened up cracks that would make it worthwhile not to turn schools simply over to right wingers, you know, or to white Christian nationalists or to white supremacists. And I tried in that book to really offer a theory of resistance that would do that. To talk about the complexity of schools, to talk about working class kids, men and women, young people who often resisted, talk about movements of resistance outside of the university that lent themselves to that sort of analysis. The other side of this is that, you know, and Kenneth talked about this in many ways, there was really an attempt at that time to do something about what was emerging in the national discourse around education. Many of you're too young to remember this, but this was the age of Reagan. You know, Reagan was elected in 1980, and this was a really terrible time for democracy because Reagan basically represented a position in which all notions of the public good were disparaged and had to be undermined. And school was, of all things, could not be seen as a public good. It had to be seen as a kind of training center, you know, to prepare people for the workforce. And out of that emerged a kind of legitimating illiteracy that seemed to suggest that anything that mattered in schools had to be operational. And I viewed that as really as a form of depoliticization. You know, it was a way to eliminate from the language of schooling all the things that mattered, whether you were talking about context, whether you were talking about theory, whether you were talking about interdisciplinarity, ethics, pedagogy, the notion of the public good. It all disappeared in that language. And if it didn't disappear, it was disparaged. And increasingly, what we saw was that was a language that increasingly legitimated a really virulent attack on public schools. And not simply in terms of what teachers said or, you know, what the curriculum was like, but in the fact that they were public. They had to fail because they were public, because this was an age of a massive drive towards a new kind of lunacy, an astonishing vacancy that organized itself around privatization. And I think you really have to understand something, that history repeats itself in some ways, though under different conditions, right? And when you look back at that emphasis on an attempt to destroy the public good, the emphasis on privatization, you all of a sudden realize that in the age of neoliberalism, which I'm sure Ken has talked to you about, something begins to happen. And that is the notion of the social begins to disintegrate. Not just education as a public good, but all those spaces where the social matters, whether it's healthcare, social services, social benefits, they all get denigrated. They all get disparaged. And the implication seems to be via Ayn Rand, and Atlas Shrugged, is that the only thing that matters is the self. And the only thing that matters is self-interest. And that the only thing that really matters is getting ahead at the expense of everybody else. And with that comes a very interesting kind of individualization. Not just that it says that we're not connected, that we need each other, we need social supports, that choices only matter when you can understand what constraints are about, inequality doesn't matter. That all goes out the window. But what really begins to emerge is a culture of cruelty, a culture that in some way has lost its ability to recognize what it means to be compassionate. But even more so, a culture that can no longer translate individual problems like poverty or unemployment. They're now individualized. And when they're individualized, they're removed from all kinds of larger social contexts. So the systemic understanding of those problems completely disappears. This is a really terrible ideology in terms of what it does, because it leaves people powerless. It leads them to blame themselves for their poverty. It offers no language. It's like the ads you see when you're driving down the highway, put out by something like General Electric. It says, climate change is important when we're all in this together. No, we're not all in this together, because I don't pollute the environment the way General Electric does. I'm sorry. So systems of power and relations of power begin to disappear. And I think the other side of this is that what you want to remember in this emerging period from 1980 to the present is that with the emphasis on privatization, the lack of public goods, the attack on the social, as the social state declines, the punishing state emerges. And what I mean by that is that social problems and institutions are increasingly criminalized. So that poverty now is not a social problem, it's a problem for the police, right? Healthcare, abortion, a woman having some sort of control, having control over her reproductive rights. That's no longer an ethical issue. I mean, no longer an issue of agency. That's now a crime. It's a crime. It's become criminalized. I mean, and of course that now applies to a whole range of groups, right? But I think as the punishing state emerges, the fascist state emerges. And I think that what this book set the language, what this book did was it provided a language that to me is more relevant today than it was then. The emphasis on agency, the emphasis on literacy, the emphasis on the public sphere, the attack. Then I talked about the culture of positivism. Then it really was the culture of neoliberalism. That's what it morphed into, and it's more punishing and defining states. So out of that, I think in many ways, I mean, it's my book, so what am I going to say? I don't think it's relevant. I mean, I think that, I think the book in many ways is more relevant today than it was then. And when I go back and I read it, I'm really generally surprised at how prescient it was. Because different periods produce different formations. And those different formations, economic, political, social, cultural, educational, they demand a different language. And they demand a different set of tools often to address them, right? So the project has to be related to the changing nature of formations. This book in some way holds up. It's incomplete, as all books are, of course, But, Ken's work sort of builds on this work and goes further than my work. But, it at least provided a foundation for a generation of students that I think in some way began to see education as central to politics, not just the schools. Began to see in some way pedagogy as providing a language that wasn't just about defending democracy, but about enabling it. I think this book provided a language that expanded the relationship between what it means to be in the world and learn how to govern rather than be governed, and the educational foundations necessary for a critical sense of agency. And I think all those issues today, in some ways, while certainly not taken up in a definitive way in this book, at least point to those categories as being even more important today than they were then.
That's terrific. Henry, maybe I could just ask you a question, and we could open it to members of the class to see if they have some questions for you. But some of the things that have happened since the book was published in 1983 speak to new kinds of constraints on teachers. For example, in 2000, the explosion of the standards and accountability movement, teaching to the test, teacher de-skilling, it vastly amplified what you described in Theory and Resistance, making the book increasingly relevant in its analysis. The new forms of educational privatization appear to be increasingly digital, and your criticisms of positivism were really prescient in terms of the datafication and commercialization of children's bodies today with the introduction of for-profit apps in schools. These speak to growing constraints, the ways that teacher agency and student agency get shut down. But I wanted to ask you, what are some of the ways that teacher and student agency get expanded now in new contexts? What are some of the hopeful movements and developments?
I think there are two things to talk about here, and it always evolves around my infatuation with the language of critique and possibility, right? And how they emerge under really enormously changing pedagogical and economic and political conditions. I think that one of the things that's clear is that the culture of positivism and the rise of neoliberalism, in light of the merging of power, new technologies, everyday life, and politics itself, has created and expanded the definition of education in ways that are enormously troubling. All you have to think about is the notion of surveillance. All you have to think about is the way data can be collected quickly on students and faculty. All you have to think about is the way in which policy now works to basically define schools not even as training centers. They're now indoctrination centers. Robin is of course teaching in Florida. I mean, you have legislators claiming that they now are going to use these technologies to examine curricula to pick out certain words, to find out if people, for instance, using words that would suggest a critique of Israel. I mean, this is beyond anything we had ever anticipated. This is not McCarthyism. It's worse than McCarthyism. McCarthyism simply went after people who might have been members of the Communist Party, right? This wants to control the very institutions, whether it be the media or whether it be schooling, that actually produce agents, that actually produce knowledge in some fundamental way. Now, the other side of this, and I think that, I don't think I'm off base in talking about this, but look, the spaces for young people to basically push the frontiers of the imagination, to talk to each other across borders, to try to begin to understand how resistance is not just individual and collective. The new media offers a space for that to happen, right? I mean, we're not just locking our doors and trying to teach against the grain of, let's say, teaching to the test. And by the way, I want to go back, just say one thing about that in light of what Ken said. You know, the nonsense about teaching to the test and the operational stuff that came out of that in the 80s under Obama and Clinton, this was not basically just about one party. It was about both parties. Mm-hmm. Both parties basically had a view of education that was enormously irrational and dominating and exploitive in the sense of preparing kids to be critically engaged individuals, willing in some way to understand the world in order to shape it. They didn't want that at all. I mean, that's for sure. But I do think that with the expansion of this notion of education, there are modes of resistance available that we've never seen before. The Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, is talking to Palestinian kids, right? They're talking to people who are engaged in resistance in Palestine, in Gaza. People are starting to realize that the teachers, for instance, starting to realize that they can collectively with young people at the very least, come together and not just shut down schools, but shut down a system. I don't believe that the question any longer is simply about raising consciousness. That's crucial, and that's the first step, and that's the precondition, and that's an educational issue. And you, as young people, have to think about all the ways in which you can do that, the multiple spheres in which that operates, that gives you the opportunity to do that. But I think the next question is, how do you translate this into something that, when the forces of repression are so overwhelming, you've got to stop that mechanism from working? By the way, that's not a call for violence. That's a call for mass strikes. That's a call for mass movements. That's a call for teachers joining unions. That's a call for young people working with teachers to walk out of schools. I mean, in other words, the machine has to be stopped. It has to be stopped. It can't go on like this. You know, it can't go on driven by a power that is entirely rooted, are you ready, in the upper 0.1% of the country. Billionaires are now defining what education are about. Billionaires are getting university presidents fired. Billionaires are saying what academic freedom and freedom of speech is about. All of a sudden, we're starting to realize something, and I don't want to scare you, but I think that what we're starting to realize is that democracy and capitalism are not the same thing, and that capitalism has reached an endpoint where it's easier to make a claim that's fascistic than it is to make promises it can't keep. Equal pay, social mobility, rising tides. It's all bullshit. We know it's bullshit. It doesn't work. It's not happening. It's not going on. And when it loses its sense of legitimacy educationally, where does it go? It blames immigrants. It blames young people. It talks about immigrants eating dogs and pets. I mean, really? It takes away the reproductive rights of women. In other words, it creates a whole series of groups that really give rise to a very fundamental thing you can't miss. This is not just about racism. It's about white nationalism. And white nationalism is more inclusive than racism. Racism is just one rail. There are other rails. And it brings all these rails together in a way that's enormously frightening. And the schools, your school, schools in general, are now under attack in a way they have never been before, never. And you have to ask yourself the question, why? And I think I have one possible answer. You're dangerous. And they know that. Thinking is dangerous and students are dangerous. And they want to shut off all the possibilities for that collective energy to mobilize itself in a way that would in some way be about economic and social justice.
A question, you stated that the forces of oppression are terrible here and that the machine has to be stopped or shut down. So I'm wondering, how do you reconcile that with the fact that the US has the most immigrants coming into this country in the world? How do you reconcile both of those ideas?
Well, I think that immigrants come because liberal democracy offers a degree of freedom that is somewhat more open than what it might be in countries where people are starving and under the rule of basically gangs. And that doesn't mean that they come to the United States because they support this massive systems of inequality. It means they come to the United States in a search for a better life. That doesn't mean that that better life is definitive and finished, and that that somehow is an indication that this is, i.e., the best country in the world. It just simply indicates it has more freedoms than other countries might have that are enormously authoritarian. But at the same time, this is not you have a president running for, you have a former president running for office that claims on the first day he's gonna basically round up, arrest, and deport 20 million immigrants. So ask yourself what that means. And of course, think about this too. I mean, we're not just talking, we're not just saying that these countries that are poor, ravaged by gangs, these countries basically are the product of the West in many ways, right? I mean, the West has engaged in colonial operations for 200 years that basically have made these countries in many ways utterly destitute. We impose policies that basically cut off trading opportunities with these countries. We put sanctions on places like Cuba. And I think we forget that. We forget two things. One, the United States in many ways plays a major role in creating these countries and the impoverishment and the problems that they have. And at the same time, they create endless wars all over the world that drive up the number of refugees who are seeking to go somewhere else. So I don't think it's a contradiction. I think it basically says two things. One, in many ways, I think the escape hatch, given the border and given the few opportunities that might be here, are certainly worth thinking about. That's not a justification for claiming this country is the best democracy in the world. One, in fact, is responsible for creating most of the problems that drive those refugees to the United States in the first place.
Question? Yeah.
Okay, so my question is, you talked about the machine being stopped. How would you respond to educators who feel constrained by structural limitations of their institutions and believe they cannot promote critical resistance effectively?
Well, I mean, that's a starting point that represents two things, right? One, I think these are teachers who make visible the lie of what a democratic and justified education should be about. That's the beginning. It makes the machine visible, a repressive element of schooling. The second element is, what do you want to do about that? I mean, how do you want to theorize that? I think there's another issue that ties in with that question, and that is, look, I don't believe any university is so repressive that there aren't some spaces of resistance. I don't believe that. There were always, in the camps, in the 1930s, there were spaces of resistance. Minor, but they were there. People always seem in some way looking for ways not to simply succumb to the domination that they find themselves in, but to find ways to thwart it. And I think there are many faculty throughout and educators in public and higher education who are doing everything they can to basically challenge the pedagogies and the politics of repression that are now taking place in the United States and abroad. So that's a good sign. I think in some cases, the levels of repression are increasingly so overwhelming that we have to be very inventive in how we want to both protect educators who are in those institutions and where we can find new spaces of resistance to address them, whether they be in the university or outside of the university. I mean, look, I'll give you an example here. In Idaho, if you talk about abortion, you can go to jail. You can go to jail, And I think in some fundamental way, teachers have to work with young people to think about how they want to address that issue. I know in ways that don't put them in jail for 10 years, right? Whether they want to do it through union education, whether they want to do it outside of the institution, whether they want to do it in ways that are utterly coded. There were always ways around this stuff, but you all know, and I hope you know, that the most fundamental issue here is changing the structure of the institution, right? It's not just working around it. These institutions we cannot allow these institutions to be turned into indoctrination centers for white Christian nationalists, which is where they're going. Mm-hmm. And I think that has to stop. You look at somebody like DeSantis, my God, this guy was born in the wrong decade. He should have been born in the 1930s in Berlin. This stuff is unheard of, what he's doing. Or people coming out saying slavery was a good thing, Republicans. Where are we? Yeah, it's so bad and so absurd that you sometimes think it's not real, that it's sort of a fantasy. But I think in the long run, what it suggests is a kind of boldness coupled with a media that is so weak, a mainstream media is so unable to basically address issues in ways in which they don't normalize the kinds of injustices we see all around us. Look, when you have Harris, who of course is one candidate, at least in some way gives lip service to the notion of democracy and certain social problems without going too far here. But on the other hand, you don't have a normal political candidate. You have a convicted felon who is basically a Nazi. So you can't just say, well, we have two views here, And you can't give a platform to people who are going to be preaching anti-Semitism. You can't give a platform to people who are going to be teaching, basically justifying racism. You don't invite Tucker Carlson into your classroom or in your institution because they don't open up discourse, they shut it down. And I think the other side of this is that we really need to think carefully about what it means to be a public intellectual, right? And one of the things I've been writing about for 40 years, I don't know if anybody's listening anymore, but we need to have 1 foot in and 1 foot out, right? You never have 2 feet in the institution, never. Because if you do, you're going to be too concerned about the rewards. You're going to be too concerned and live in fear. You have to arrive at a point where you say, I have to do this. It's a matter of integrity. I have no choice because I'm not going to live on my knees. And if something happens, that's a chance you take. I mean, that's not a call to be silly. It's not a call to put your job in danger every minute, but it's a call to recognize at what point the value of living in a world with a conscience is more important than the pragmatics of having a job. That's all. I mean, I was fired, as Ken knows, I was fired in 1981 from Boston University. I was denied tenure, though I went through the whole process unanimously. But the president of the university was named John Silber. He was a reactionary, terrible reactionary. And he basically eliminated from Boston University anybody who was on the left. Nobody got tenure, right? Whether they were feminists, people dealing with Black history, radical education, they all went. And he called me to his office at the end of the year, and he said, "Look, I'll make a deal with you." He said, "If you allow me to be your tutor for 2 years in politics, science, and education," he said, "I'll freeze your salary, and at the end of 2 years, we'll reconsider you for tenure." And I have had people actually say to me, "Well, that sounds like a good deal." I thought, no, I'm afraid not. And I said something to him like, with a different reference, right? I said, "What do you want to do? Turn me into Tucker Carlson?" I used a different name than a name you would recognize. And I left, and that was it. And I had no choice. I mean, would I do it over? Of course I would do it over. I mean, to think that you can sell yourself simply for what neoliberal theorists believe is the ultimate reward in life, and that is making money, that means you become complicit with something that you don't want to do.
Well, Henry, we're a little over the time we talked about. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us tonight. It's fantastic hearing you. We're very excited about the new re-release of Theory and Resistance in Education, an absolute classic, which to me, I think is more relevant than it's ever been.